Welcome to the Donna Sebo Show Special Editions. This program is dedicated to featuring authors and experts from around the world who will share their knowledge and insight with you. The viewing and listening audience, literacy and education are the keys to freedom, and diversity enables one to live in a world with broader perspectives. This is Donna Sebo, and I will be your host for the next hour. Hello and welcome to the Donna Sebo Television Show Special Editions. This program is dedicated to providing information about various topics, and we've got a very important one with this program, and it is about mental illness as well as homelessness. We have three wonderful people that are sharing their expertise and their experience with you, and I'll tell you what, I've had them on my radio shows. For those of you that are tuning in for the first time, I have done interviews with authors for well over 22 years. And consequently, what has evolved is the opportunity to bring some of those authors to you in a visual format through this programming. We pick a topic with every show that we do. This one, as I've already said, is relating to mental illness and also its association with homelessness. In today's world, we have quite a bit of a challenge with this. I'm in the Seattle area, and each of my guests live in a different part of the country. These are problems that they have experienced, each in their own unique way. I would like to introduce each of my guests. My first guest, Dr. Karen Gidney. She is a woman that has a phenomenal publication. And I remember when I first received it to find out that she was the first woman doctor in a male maximum security prison. You know, Dr. Gedney, you have a story to share that is going to be just wonderful for people to understand that working in an all-male prison had quite a few challenges, and I'm so delighted to have you as a guest.
Well, I appreciate that, Donna.
Then my second guest is a gentleman that has worked with people on the street. It is Dr. Robert Orkin. And I believe, Dr. Orkin, you are in San Francisco. Your publication is about silent voices. And you were a guest on my radio show, and your story is incredible because of your background as well. I want to welcome you to the show.
Thank you. And Donna, my name is Okin, O-K-I-N.
Thank you for correcting me. I appreciate that. And then Major General Greg Martin. I am so pleased that you're able to join me. Your broadcast actually was aired just the other evening on my daily show, as well as on Warriors for Peace. And I'm so glad that we've been able to connect you because you have such a phenomenal story, and your book is Bipolar General. And I want to welcome you to the show.
Thank you, Donna.
With each of you, when I interviewed you, I found that there was a very common thread, and that thread dealt with the issue of mental illness. Dr. Gerdney, when you were working as a prison doctor, you started when? 1978?
No, 1987.
1987. So what made you decide that you were going to accept a position that, to the best of your knowledge, no other woman had done, working in an all-male maximum security prison?
And that was in the state of Nevada. I am unclear if there were any other women back in those days that went or were in any prisons, but I was a National Health Service Corps doctor. I owed 4 years to the federal government. And what a lot of people don't know is that in 1976, a U.S. Supreme Court case known as Estelle versus Gamble really basically said that prisons couldn't be deliberately indifferent to serious medical need. And at that time, half the prisons in our country really didn't have medical care for the inmate population. And it takes a while, but lawsuits occurred, and the governor of Nevada was really under lawsuits, and he needed to get a doctor to work in the prison. And doctors didn't, in those days, decide that was a great professional move. They didn't pay well. They were highly dangerous in those days in terms of hostage taking and things like that. So they couldn't get a doctor. And the federal government put me in the prison because I had to do 4 years. Quite a shock for me to end up in the prison. But for all sorts of reasons, I stayed and turned it into my calling and lasted 30 years.
With your time in the prison, you're an internal medicine specialist. This is something that in working in the prison, how did those inmates respond to you? Because this is something that is common.
Well, the big thing in the prison world is that, and especially in my field, I'm a jack of all trades, so they were seeing me for everything. We eventually did get a psychiatrist, but they tended to be deployed to different places. I was in one prison, and ultimately that prison developed a 120-bed hospital, which I also took care of. And with the mentally ill individuals, I did the best I could. And then a lot of them who ultimately needed significant psychiatric medications would see the psychiatrist, but many times we didn't have them. And then I would be writing the medications and taking care of them.
That's quite a challenge. Now, silent voices, people with mental disorders on the street. And when I read your publication, I was really astonished. But you have received so much recognition for your work, Dr. Arkin. I just am absolutely impressed with everything that you've been engaged with. But I was intrigued why photography was such a significant connection for you, and why did you decide that you wanted to explore the homeless and the people with mental disorders that were on the streets of San Francisco?
Well, it started innocently enough with my walking to my car in San Francisco one rainy night, and I saw a little woman curled up on the sidewalk trying to keep dry. And for weeks afterwards, she kept coming into my mind. I couldn't imagine how she kept struggling against the elements night after night. So I decided to spend some time on the street asking homeless people if they'd talk to me about their lives. I had been chief of psychiatry at the hospital for many years, but I wanted to try to get a visceral understanding of how these people coped, bearing the stresses, the grime, the violence, the extreme deprivations of life on the street. I wanted to know how they managed with no bathrooms, often no food, no place to sleep. And I also wanted to know what they thought about with so much empty time on their hands, and what their joys and what their regrets were, whether they had any vision at all for their lives beyond just pushing their carts around the city endlessly. I guess, as I think back to it, I guess I wanted to understand what it was really like to live in their skin and walk in their shoes.
You are a world.
What they were like as human beings,
Mm-hmm.
Beyond their carts, their rags, their tin cups. And I guess I also wanted to understand what we had in common, not just the ways we were different from each other.
You're a recognized expert around the world. You have been working in the area of psychiatry, mental illness. You have had such a background, and you've been recognized for your work, and especially in other countries. There have been so many people that have really appreciated your work. What was it like when you stepped into this different environment where you had people that came from all kinds of backgrounds? You had all kinds of backgrounds, and you go, how do you relate? Someone watching this right now might say, I would be afraid to walk up to someone like that. And here you are with a camera. You've got a camera in hand, and you're asking them questions, and you're investigating them. You're interested in them. You're being nosy. Let's face it. You're trying to find out things about them. Yeah. And they opened up to you. They opened up to you. That's quite an accomplishment.
I have to say, I expected that they'd blow me off and refuse to talk to me. And I found exactly the opposite. They seemed genuinely pleased that I was interested in their lives. Most of these people had been really neglected as children, and they feel invisible as people on the street. So seeing that I was interested in their lives seemed to mean a lot to them. I also
Amazing.
expected that I would find people with tough outer shells who were going to be very difficult to connect with. But instead, I found people who were really exquisitely sensitive and very willing to talk to me with surprising candor and intensity about often the most intimate aspects of their lives. And it may be hard to believe this, but most of the people I talked to had tears in their eyes during much of the interviews. You know,
Amazing.
one of the reasons that I wanted to photograph people, and I didn't start out that way, I just thought I would interview them and record the interviews, but I was so struck by their faces. You know, the suffering was just etched into their faces in a way that went beyond what they could say in words. So that's when I began asking them, could I photograph you while we're talking about your lives? I didn't want to stage the photographs. I didn't want to say, well, stand over here and let me get the lighting and so on. So I just wanted to get the authentic person behind the story. And that's what led to the photographs.
Major General Greg Martin, I know you've retired, so I hope you don't mind my calling you Greg. But
Perfect.
wonderful. Your book absolutely amazed me because of your candor, because of the service that you've given to this country, because of the extenuating circumstances and information regarding your journey with something you didn't even know was an issue with you, being bipolar. There was nothing in family history, nothing there. So, Greg, when you went through this and you were sitting down and writing this book, why did you decide to become public with it? It is something we've all heard of PTSD. We have all heard about how much soldiers suffer after being, on the ground in battle and combat and just extenuating circumstances. But you were a high-ranking officer, and it's not something that most people are going to even want to talk about. I know people that do not have the positioning like you had that wouldn't even acknowledge that they had a challenge. Why did you decide to write your book?
I decided to write my book because I went through a horrendous experience with bipolar disorder, and I came out the other end, healthy, happy, my marriage and family intact. And I thought I had an obligation to tell this story, what happened to me, how I dealt with it, and what the lessons learned are. I felt I owed it to, society everywhere to share these lessons. And the big reason was I was from teenage years on, nothing but successful student, athlete, leader, tremendous energy, drive, enthusiasm, optimism. And it just carried me all the way through my Army career where I got, top ratings, great jobs, advanced civil schooling, all this sort of stuff. But then what happened was over those decades from teenage years into my 40s, I was on the bipolar spectrum, which I didn't realize. I never even heard about that term, although that's how it's viewed now. So I went from low on the spectrum up, up, up over decades until I was in my 40s. I was in a sub bipolar state. And then in 2003, during the Iraq War, I was a brigade commander leading thousands of troops in combat. And according to the VA and the Army Medical Department, it was the combination of the thrill, euphoria, stress of leading troops it triggered my genetic predisposition for bipolar disorder. And then for the next 11 years, unknown, unrecognized, undiagnosed, I went as a senior officer, a colonel, and then a general. I went into higher and higher mania, lower and lower depression, developed psychosis until in 2014, I literally went into a state of madness, insanity. I was in full blown mania, was fired from my job, forced to retire, hospitalized. And then that led to 2 years of bipolar hell, where I was in a state of crippling, hopeless depression, terrifying psychosis. And then finally, 2 years later, I pulled out of it by taking lithium, which I was prescribed. And once I started taking lithium, within 3 days, my depression and psychosis pretty much vanished. And that was 7 years ago. So I've been on this recovery journey. And, 3 years ago, I decided I'm going to write a book. And, I, over a course of a year, wrote the manuscript, and then it just was published. It just came out about 2 weeks ago. So that's really why I did it, to serve humanity.
Wow. Well, one of the things that you bring out in the book, and it's brought out right at the beginning, was that because of what was found out about you, that you found out that two of your sons, you had 3 boys, you and your wife, and those 2 of those children ended up having the bipolar situation. Now, there were terms that you used. There was a term that you used relative to when you were younger that doctors gave you, saying it was a particular indicator of what was going to be happening years later. But your son, and please correct me if I don't get the name correctly, was it Philip that ended up having major problems? And then he was diagnosed with bipolar. And then what was your other son that was diagnosed with bipolar?
Connor.
Are you able to hear me, Greg?
Yes, his name was Connor.
Oh, Connor. Okay. Sorry, I couldn't hear that. But with each of them, what was the difference between the 2 of them? Because you had no family history of this at all.
Right. So my onset of bipolar disorder, I was 47, and they call that late bipolar onset. And I was diagnosed ultimately with bipolar disorder type 1 with psychosis. Now, and that was in, much later than my sons. They both had onset as teenagers, about 17 years old. And the oldest, Philip, he was initially diagnosed with bipolar disorder unspecified. And it looked a lot like bipolar disorder type 1, where he went into mania, depression, and then had these swings. And he's 40 now, very talented, very bright, but his life has been very hard in every way, with work, schooling, relationships. And then the youngest son, Connor, he also was diagnosed at 17, initially with depression, unipolar depression. And then over the years, mania, hypomania started to kick in. And then ultimately, he also was diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 2. And again, same story, a very talented, smart kid, and life has just been hard. It's been a struggle. The term you mentioned at the beginning was hyperthymia, which is a near continuous state of mild mania. And so that's the mood type, the personality type that I had from teenage years on until my onset of bipolar, which then, upped me to a different level, into real mania.
It's quite a story. And I think that it's very significant, because there are people that may have youngsters in the family that are going through challenges, and they don't even have any way of recognizing it. This is very important. Dr. Gedney, when you were dealing in the prison, it has been said that there are so many inmates that have mental illness. And this is something for you that had to have been a challenge at times, because your story about what it was like inside the prison and dealing with the various prisoners, you've had so many different encounters with so many different types of personalities, some of them extremely violent, but yet you were able to create a connection. Do you think that in being a woman in the male environment, which they don't have any other contact with, a female, do you think that actually helped you in being able to communicate effectively with people that were in the prison?
I think that actually helped somewhat, because with the male population, they had experienced, let's say, significant abuse or power struggles with men, which put them far more on the defensive. And as a female, that didn't happen. They actually wanted to win me over, not confront me that much. I also think that the biggest thing, and like Dr. Orkin said, is if you listen and you care, that is all the difference in the world. And in the prison, I think very similarly to people on the streets, those incarcerated and those street people tend not to feel compassion or that anyone truly cares about them. And then in the prison, the other dilemma is that the prisons were really, let's say, established to punish. So they actually are even in a worse situation, I think, than many homeless people in terms of an emotional side, because they don't have autonomy. And especially the mentally ill, if they have issues with custody, then custody can put them in solitary confinement, which is the worst thing possible for someone who has mental health problems. Then also, if they get in trouble, they end up losing their ability to do any programming. It can lengthen their sentences. And so there is a lot of, let's say, punishment that goes on because of their underlying behavior, which many of them do not have real good control over. And so they get more angry, more depressed. And of course, then you have suicide attempts and actual suicides. And of course, you have the fights. And mentally ill people do not want to be crowded in a tight little area because they are very, well, they are worried that they're going to be taken advantage of. And we have units in prisons which are basically overcrowded, where individuals are sleeping like head to toe. And also the sounds in the prison. There's nothing like being in a concrete box and hearing clanging gates, which is very disruptive to their, let's say, just their underlying sense of feeling safe. And in the custody world, you have officers who in no way are trained to take care of people that have mental health issues. Every state is different, but Nevada, as an example, you can be 18 years old, apply to be a custody officer. You have 6 weeks of training, and they give you keys and guns, and you're responsible for individuals who are very difficult to take care of. And that can lead to very bad situations. And prisons and custody many times have the same issues as police, where they hang together and sometimes they protect, let's say, their rotten apples in the group. And you can have officers who actually literally incite the mentally ill people, and that is extra dangerous. So, and what most people don't realize or think about is that when they leave the prison, they literally have what's termed now post-incarceration stress disorder. Sort of like the military, they have PTSD and or different events, but prison is a different type of, let's say, stress disorder, because they get put out. And if you have 20 years of always being told what to do, you don't really, you've lost your autonomy to figure out what you want to do. I have had many inmates, as an example, where they go out and they walk into a Walmart and they literally have panic attacks because they can't even figure out what toothpaste to get because there's so many different varieties and they've had just one little tube, for years. And so, and then the prison has count times multiple times a day. So they would get anxious at certain time periods, during the day. And just hearing keys jangle can create their heart rate to go up.
Yeah.
Sleep. And people want the lights off. They've been sleeping with lights on for decades. They can't handle the dark. So there's a lot of issues that families face if someone comes back and they don't understand why they have problems like that. And the Prison Policy Initiative, which really looks at statistics, they feel that 40% of those people coming into the prison can be established as mental health disorders.
Wow. 40%? That is in.
And depending who you read and how
Yes.
broad or narrow they say is mental health, I've seen everywhere from 37% to 64%, but there is a
Incredible.
significant amount that end up in prison.
So, your 30 years, you have seen so many different aspects of the environment of the prison life. And this is something that most civilians don't even want to come close to understanding it. And you bring out in your book the fact, 30 years as a prison doctor, you bring out the fact that it is something we need to pay attention to, because prisoners that end up going back into prison after being released, the rate is fairly high. And just from what you've described, it makes sense. They can't adjust to the outside.
Very hard for them to adjust leaving. And I really look at prisons where they should approach it holistically, where you want to prevent people from going into the prison. And in the prison, you actually help whatever they have going on that's wrong, which it tends not to really happen in prisons for the most part. And then you truly have to support them when they leave. But that's not how you see the prisons operate. They're very much an industry that many companies benefit from.
I don't think many people would even be aware of that. That would not even cross their minds. You also, when I had a chance to talk to you, talked about how many of the prisoners that go out can end up being on the streets, being homeless. And they end up, because of the circumstances, ending up going back into prison. So it's like a vicious circle.
It's a very vicious circle, because depending on their prior charges, there are places they can't live. They can't live near a school if they have any sexual offense. They can't get subsidies in terms of food stamps because they have a record. They don't have money really when they leave. Many of the inmates have a lot of debt. Nevada was notorious for charging inmates for medical care, so they were saddled with thousands and thousands of dollars of debt. And many times families have written them off. And if they go out, it's very difficult for them to get a place to live. And if they don't have a residence, that's a parole violation, which then causes them to be put back in prison because they're not living at a residence. So it's really sort of crazy if you look at it and wanted to actually improve the situation.
Struck by the similarities between the people that you're talking about and patients who were basically dumped out of state hospitals.
Right, yes.
In the 70s. I mean, these were people who lived in total institutions, right?
Right.
Whether they be prisons or state mental hospitals, they were total institutions. They had virtually no autonomy. They were told what to do. They were given food and a bed and a roof over their heads. And when they were dumped out, they were given nothing. It was largely a way that state governments tried to save money on the backs of the mentally ill. They weren't given housing, they weren't given treatment. And the result was that 600,000 mentally ill people ended up on the street.
Dr. Irvin, you bring up a very, very good point.
Because when I was looking at trying to understand the laws, what happened was under Ronald Reagan, he really pushed through Congress to, stop that HMSA type of bill, because when they were pushed out, they were supposed to have money in the community side to really help these individuals, but that was basically obliterated. So the thought was, take them out of the institution, put them in the community, and we'll support. And then Reagan was, well, we're not going to fund that. So that was a disaster.
The result is that we have a tremendous number of people who had experienced state mental hospitals that ended up on the street. And that was really the first major group of people who came into our cities and became homeless.
Right. And then many of them bounced into the prison world in a little circle in jails, prisons, street, going around in circles.
And that still happens.
Yes.
Many cities across the country have passed ordinances that make it a criminal act to sleep on the streets.
Right.
Well, where's a homeless person going to sleep?
Yeah.
If not on the street? So they're cited, they're put in jail, and they often do terribly in jail for some of the reasons that you mentioned. And then they get thrown out of jail at the end of their sentences with nothing having been accomplished, with no money, no housing, no services, back on the street. They get cited again and put back in jail, and it just becomes a kind of a vicious cycle between the streets and the jails and the streets and the jails.
Dr. Oken,
I know that LA County Jail was the largest,
Yes.
the largest mentally health place in the country, because there's just thousands in that place.
Dr. Orkin, I wanted to ask you a question because you present quite a bit of information relative to the homeless and to the mentally ill. You say that $40,000 per year it costs to take care of people or leaving them on the street, yet it would only cost, and we were using, I believe, the city of San Francisco as an example in your book. You said it would be $24,000 a year to provide housing and services. So here we have a tremendous discrepancy relative to the amount of money that would be spent. But I was astonished when you mentioned how the San Francisco Department of Public Works spend $30 million a year, $30 million a year just to pick up, what is it, 120,000 needles? I mean, who spends the time to count the needles? But it really is amazing. They're talking about sums of money that are just astonishing to me, because we have a major epidemic. I'm in the Seattle area, and the mental health issues that we're experiencing with the homeless, with the drug addiction, the various types of illnesses that affect people, and you see them. And with COVID, when that happened, it just increased the amount of people that are in that situation. And I feel a great deal of empathy and concern for those that are in public service, like your police officers, your people in the fire department. They see this every day, and they don't really know what to do because their hands are tied. They have to be concerned about the public health situations, all of this. These numbers that you give in your book, Silent Voices, are just incredible. I mean, this is huge.
I think people don't really recognize how expensive it is for society, for the taxpayer, to keep someone homeless. And the reason they don't really understand it is because the cost of homelessness is buried in many different city departments, in the hospital departments and police, the courts, jails, emergency rooms, ambulances. So it's all segregated like this, and it's very difficult for people, unless they're doing research on the subject, to actually aggregate these costs. So it's why people are always surprised to hear that it's about twice as expensive to leave someone homeless as to take care of them. Clearly, we're not abandoning people who are homeless for economic reasons, because if we were just to follow our own economic self-interest, we would take care of them and provide housing and services. No, we're abandoning them because we largely despise them. That may sound harsh, but it's true. We stigmatize them, we blame them, we marginalize them, we segregate them, we push them into the cycle that Karen and I were talking about before. And we do it as an expression of our dislike of these people. And then we blame them for their bad luck. And as Karen points out in her book, most of these people in both, both populations, most of these people came from terrible backgrounds. So many of them were neglected and abused as children. 40% of the women that I met on the street had been sexually abused as girls. I mean, they were out of luck from the moment they arrived. And once you're homeless, it's very hard to get out of the streets by yourself without government help. It's almost impossible.
I understand. Greg, when you were getting your medical assistance, one of the things that you mentioned in your book, especially when you were going into that very serious phase, the manic phase, you actually had been examined 3 times by psychiatrists, and they said you were fit, you were fine, there was nothing wrong with you. You actually, and correct me if I'm not remembering it correctly, you really felt, you knew something was wrong, and you said, no, something is wrong. How was it they were able to determine the bipolar positioning? What was it that enabled them to finally recognize, after having put you through so many tests, and they came out and they said, you're fine, you're absolutely wonderful? How were they able to finally discern what you were trying to find out yourself, because you knew something was wrong?
Well, the only time I thought something was wrong was when I was in a depressed state. When I was in a state of mania, I felt like Superman, the smartest guy in the world, held the key to world peace. So even when I was in the highest level of mania, I didn't think there was anything wrong with me. But going back from onset in 2003 to diagnosis in 2014, 3 times during that period, I went in by myself to the doctor for depression. And I said, hey, I'm depressed. I normally have tons of energy and I'm really upbeat, but I'm depressed. And all 3 times they said, you're fine, there's nothing wrong. Then when I got fired in the July of 2014, and I was in a state of, acute full-blown mania, when, what the boss did, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff called me in and said, Greg, I love you like a brother. You've done an unbelievable job. I give your job performance an A+, but your time at National Defense University is over. You have till 5 p.m. today to resign or you're fired. And I'm ordering you to get a mental health exam this week. So in July 2014, I went in 3 times and saw a psychiatrist. And all 3 times, even though I was in a state of acute mania, they said, you're fine, you're fit for duty, there's nothing wrong with you. And in retrospect, what I think happened is, number one, they were really intimidated by my rank. They were, my age, I was in my 50s. And so I think they wanted to give me the benefit of the doubt that it was just the stress of the job. And I also don't think the medical people had a conversation with my chain of command. And so I don't think they understood all the observations and complaints and letters from people saying that I had essentially, gone mad. And so I think they didn't have a complete picture. Plus, as the 2 doctors would tell you, diagnosing bipolar disorder is not easy. It can be masked by successful performance and all kinds of other things. And so so I was misdiagnosed 3 times when I was manic. And then I went into hopeless, crippling depression. And then I knew something was wrong. I absolutely knew my brain was sick because I was so depressed. I was crippled. I couldn't make a decision. I was confused. I was isolated. Couldn't go to work. It was just absolutely horrible. And so then I went myself in to see the same doctors and I said, hey, I am barely surviving. And I also have, suicidal ideations. I want to die. I don't want to live. And then they said, aha, you're very, very depressed right now. And then they were able to connect the dots back to how I normally was. And then they reached their diagnosis of bipolar disorder type 1 with psychosis. And when I got the diagnosis, I was happy. I thanked the doctor. I gave him a big hug and said, hey, I know I'm sick. And now at least I know what the label is and what the sickness is. And I can begin to start recovering and healing. So thank you, doctor.
You also are deeply involved with educating people about mental illness, and there are so many vets. I have had conversations with a number of them, and it saddens me because it seems like there's such a difficult conversation. Many times, soldiers are just men and women both. They don't feel safe in talking about what they're going through. And of course, they're coming home to families. It's not unlike what Dr. Gurney said about those released from prison. They have, they're having to adapt. And is there any way that in the military that they could, my goodness, the numbers are just as astronomical of those that have PTSD and challenges, and they come home and they're just feeling lost. And sometimes it will go down deep within a person and then just all of a sudden erupt and just come up. And then they might end up doing something that causes them to go to prison. Or, they have groups of vets in the prisons from what Dr. Gedney writes about in her book. There's a special vets group. So you have all of this that goes on, and your story is so powerful, Bipolar General. What do you have any suggestions relative to this? Because there are thousands of men and women that are being affected in this way, and they feel a lot like the homeless do. There's no place for them. Where are they going to go? What are they going to do? Who can they talk to?
Well, great question. First off, the military has improved its understanding and care for mental health enormously since 9/11, 22 years ago. I mean, the difference from before we started these long wars, these forever wars, to now is almost like night and day in terms of the education, the training, the peer support systems, the pushing down of mental health resources to lower and lower levels. The way that if any, like when I left the military in 2015, there was no continuity of care plan for me. I was like just basically dumped into the civilian healthcare system with no plan. Now, any service member who's being dealt with for mental health, there's a deliberate, positive handover to either the VA or a civilian provider. But the problems, you described them well. I mean, the problem is enormous. It's way bigger than people even realize. And so what do I tell these veterans? Because I talk to them, every day, and in various forums. So here's what I tell them. Look, mental illness and bipolar disorder being one of them, often results in destroyed marriages, families, careers, finances. It often leads to addictions, homelessness, incarceration, death, and suicide. So that's reality. That's reality staring them in the face. And that's terrible, grim, deadly news. But the good news is that if they would go and get professional medical help, which many of them are eligible for through the VA or through other retired military or whatever. Now a lot aren't, because a lot of them maybe didn't do the things they needed to do or have enough time in service to get continuity of healthcare. But many of them are, and they're eligible for healthcare. So the good news is that if you get diagnosed and you get good treatment and you take those steps and you follow what the doctors tell you to do, you can live a life of health, happiness, purposefulness. Now, that doesn't mean your life's going to be easy, because as my book, Bipolar General, and the subtitle is My Forever War with Mental Illness, it never ends. I mean, bipolar disorder never goes away. I'm never going to be cured. So I have to manage my health and my situation like anybody with a chronic disease like diabetes. So I have to be really smart and be medically healthy and sound in order to stay, in good shape. But so I tell the veterans, take these steps, go see a medical professional, and you can get your life back and live a life that is really productive, meaningful, and happy.
That is very significant, and it's wonderful that you've gone public with it. Dr. Karen Gedney, I wanted to read something out of your book. You have a prayer for the insane that was put in here. There's so much detail in your book, 30 Years Behind Bars, and I thought I wanted to share it with the audience because it's very significant. Mental illness and homelessness are two huge issues. We're dealing with them in Seattle. We are seeing stories and commentaries that are being made by people all over the country. We have had, since COVID, there have been so many different concerns expressed, especially for young people, because often the younger generation doesn't have the resiliency of the older generation. But this really meant quite a bit to me, and it was written by I.S. The gate shrieks open, the sound of dying mice as the crazy one drifts out for his day in the sun. He keeps his thoughts in a bugler can, entangled with tobacco strands, rolled tight, afraid perhaps his thoughts might dissipate. He shuffles in circles as psych technicians measure his dampened dance, a circus performer for the slow-sighted, a mourning for the mentally marooned. Those words are at the beginning of a poem, and it ends with, at the intrusion of his holy dance, his tongue lashing out in a wild attempt to taste freedom as he pleads with the voice of an innocent child. We don't have the time to read the whole poem, but it's significant. It is significant because it speaks, just in those few words, about someone who doesn't know what to do with their mental condition. Dr. Gedney, you are dedicating a great deal of your time to making a voice heard, if you will, for those who are in prison, incarcerated. And I can hear the comments in my mind of people saying, oh my goodness, they've broken the law, and there are some horrific things that some of these people in prison have done. And it's not taking away from that at all. But the psychiatric needs of prisoners are so often very, very difficult to even deal with. I know we only have a few minutes left. What would you want to make as a suggestion? Because we do see this returning to prison, people not adapting well mentally. If they have a problem, maybe it has become magnified while they're in prison and then explodes when they go outside. They don't know what to do with their life. What are your observations and suggestions?
Well, I think my largest suggestion, which is always what medicine should always be about, is preventing whatever you don't want. And that prevention, when you look at what causes mental illness and what puts them at risk for things really going badly, are many times what's called the adverse childhood experiences. And for me, it's very much the socioeconomic poverty, the violence, undiagnosed and untreated mentally ill in parents that then affect children. And I really think that our society has to get used to front-ending things instead of taking care of problems when they have really become significant at the end. I find that I've been in two worlds, the medical world and the prison world, and both worlds are operating on all of the energy is on the tail end, which is the hardest thing to actually change. And I really think that people have to realize you want to front load money on preventing these things in the first place, so you don't end up with so much prison and homelessness. And really, it would be a boon for public society. But people don't think like that. Mm-hmm. And then on top of it, you really do have industries that make money on the tail end of problems, whether it's medicine or prisons.
With all three of my guests, and Dr. Okun, when you wrote your book, you've done such an expose with your photography, which you have a number of phenomenal photographs and stories about different individuals. What is your perception as a professional? You see the homeless situation around the world, not just here in the United States. But what would you want people to know? Could you sum it up shortly in something that you feel would be like a little capsule of thought that people could carry with them?
Well, since public policy tends to reflect the attitudes of the culture toward, in this case, people who are homeless, I would say that at the very least, it's really crucial that as a society, we examine and re-examine our attitudes toward these people and remember that it's largely terrible luck that brought them to their knees. I mean, it didn't just happen. It occurred systematically because of terrible luck in their childhoods. And we've got to remember that once they become homeless, it's just almost impossible for them to get out of the streets without government's help. Government largely created this problem, or at least stood by passively, whether it be in people's childhoods or subsequently, and let this humanitarian train wreck develop. So we've got to hold ourselves through our governments, because our governments are us. They're not some abstract entity. We've got to hold ourselves and our governments accountable for solving this problem. It's not rocket science. It does require an outlay of funds, but we can't just continue to turn a blind eye, because it's not just the people themselves on the streets who are suffering. Society as a whole suffers when we pass people on the street who have nothing and who are in tents or in sleeping bags. All of us are harmed by the homelessness that's rampant in this society. And it's much greater in this society, in the United States, than in many Western democracies, largely because the disparity of wealth in this society is so much greater than in other societies. And the result of that is that people at the bottom have almost nothing, while people at the very top control and own, a huge percentage of society's wealth. So if we don't start there, we're not going to be able to solve this problem. And if we don't speak up, then we'll be living with this problem for the next 100 years, and we'll only have ourselves to blame.
Major General Greg Martin, what would you want our veterans and the people that have veterans in their families to know? As your book goes into so much detail, and I know you're very dedicated to communicating that there is help, that there is a chance, but we have so many vets that are on the street. What would you like for them to know?
I would say there's always hope. And, there was a period of a couple of years where all I wanted to do was die and didn't want to be alive. And I had no hope. I never thought that I would be able to pull myself out of this bipolar hell that I was living in. But there was hope. A battle buddy told me, he said, "Hey, you're going to make it. You can do it. My son has bipolar disorder. He made it. So let's get you into the VA hospital," which I'm very grateful that I had, that type of resource to go to. And he was right. There was hope. I would also say that bipolar disorder is really an amazing disease that is a double-edged sword. It elevated and boosted and enhanced my performance for years and decades, and it helped me tremendously to reach the success and become a general officer that I did. But once it goes too high, it can be destructive and deadly. And I would say that I am extremely grateful that I'm not only a bipolar survivor, but I'm a thriver, and I'm now a warrior who is, in the battle with regard to mental illness and advocacy.
I want to thank each of you for being a guest on my show. I think we've shared some phenomenal information. Major General Greg Martin, Dr. Karen Gedney, and Dr. Robert Okun, thank you very much for being with me. It's just been a pleasure having you as guests on my program. I want to say goodbye, and I know that we have run out of time here. We could probably talk for a lot longer, but I want to welcome you and to invite you to be a part and to listen to the broadcast, the audio of this interview that I've had with these three very significant people. It will be on my daily show, so you can just Google Donna Sebo, and you'll find that the network information for the radio programming, as well as information for the television programs that we produce, are very much available to you 24/7. Thank you for joining us.
You have been listening to the Donna Sebo Show special editions. The audio version of this program will also be heard on the Donna Sebo Show radio broadcast. We are delighted you were able to join us and invite you to share this programming with your friends and family. Have a rich and fulfilling life.